In the following videos, we're going to be exploring projection, mapping, and image-based modeling. But before we get into the nuts and bolts, I kind of wanted to talk about some general concepts of what's possible and sort of just the gist of how this stuff works. So let's say that we had a very simple scene. In this case, we have a cylinder and a sphere, and we are going to photograph this scene. This is an actual physical scene. So we set up the camera, and as we've learned in previous lectures, once we know the focal length and the image plane for a camera, we can figure out exactly what its field of view is. So this cone here. So anyway, we photograph this, and once we photograph this, in this case the cylinder is closer to the camera than the sphere, we get an image that would be something like this. It'd be the cylinder sort of eclipsing the sphere just a little bit, let's say. Something like that. So what if we were to take this camera, and rather than it being a camera, we were to convert this camera into a projector? So we will take this image that we photographed and we'll put it right back into the camera, and we'll project that back into the scene. Well, intuitively, if we haven't touched anything regarding the lens or the size of the image plane, the field of view should match exactly the same, which also means that everything will project right back to where it was originally. So we're essentially just taking the same scene and projecting it back onto the original scene. So this is interesting, and it's a really fancy light source, but what if we were to take the camera and make a virtual version? As we've learned from the tile world exercises, we can create virtual versions of these cameras as well. So we create the virtual version of the camera, and we put it back in exactly the same place where it was in this physical set. Put it the same height off the ground. We give it the same tilt angle here. Make sure that it's positioned relative to these objects at the same distance to these objects. And then we project our photograph back into the scene. Now it's starting to get interesting, because we can essentially paint very simple geometry. It doesn't have to have as many of the details of the original scene. It doesn't even have to have any kind of surfacing information or shaders. It can just be a simple constant shader, and we can project the photograph that we took right back into our virtual set and create something that looks photographically real just based on the stuff that was in the original photograph. Now, there are some limitations here, of course. In this particular case, if we've only got one image, we've only got one field of view. And as you can see here, the cylinder is kind of eclipsing the sphere, which means that from the camera's perspective, the cylinder is kind of casting a shadow onto the sphere. So if we were to try to rephotograph this from any other angle than, say, where the original camera was, we're going to see the shadows that these things cast, this cylinder on the sphere, and then if there was a ground here, they'd both be casting a shadow on the ground. So we would get an effect of a crack or a double image. Let's say we would see this cylinder projected on this sphere, because that's the only image we have for that area. But we don't have any restriction of just doing one image. We're going to do a top view here. So here's the cylinder, and here's the sphere. Try to make it look a little bit more sphere-like. So if the camera was here, and we're projecting on here, and we had that little shadow casting from the edge of the cylinder, we could always just take another angle, and it doesn't even have to have the same field of view on the lens. We only have to know the field of view for each individual setup, but it's a little easier if you just use the same setup on the lens and everything. Project this image back into the scene, and now as you can see, this camera's view of the scene doesn't have the problem of the cylinder casting a shadow on the sphere. So now the sphere can get a nice, clean, full texture. So we could use this one to fill in the crack of the shadow from this one into there. And we could do the same thing even for the shadows on the ground. If the ground was getting a lot of shadows, I guess you could conceivably get, if you could get the camera up high from this view that we're looking down on here, you could shoot an angle from here and fill in all of the shadows that would be behind these objects based on the field of view of these lenses. So we could project straight down from this view, let's say, assuming you could get the camera up to this high, and project onto those areas. So those are the general concepts of projection. A very important factor is the issue of field of view. It's more important even than in the tile worlds because everything has to be quite precise. You need to get the virtual objects to be in precisely the same position that the physical objects in the scene were positioned, and you have to position the camera to be in precisely the same place in the virtual world as it was in the real world. But once you have those conditions satisfied, you can get tons of mileage out of this technique. You can even use it for unwrapping textures. For example, if you were to project the texture from the camera like this onto an object that had UV maps already applied to it, what you could do is then you could, in the case of a cylinder, let's say it doesn't have caps on the top and bottom, you could unwrap this cylinder this way until what you got was the cylinder's view of the scene unwrapped into a regular flat texture here. So this technique can even be used for generating traditional UV mapped textures by unwrapping something that's being projected into UV space. And we'll look at a simple example of that in the exercise. But that's the gist of projection mapping. It'll make a little bit more sense as we get into it, and especially when we get into the image-based modeling part. You'll see how we can use the known view and position of the camera to derive the position of the objects in the scene using photogrammetry in the software. Before we look at an example of projecting photographs back onto geometry and calibrating everything, let's look at a perfect example using computer graphics. Everything will line up exactly right using this technique, and it might be a little bit more obvious what's going on. So I've created our virtual scene here. This could just as easily be a real scene. And this is the view of the camera right here, camera 1. This is what it would see. So you can see the objects kind of occlude each other a little bit. And so we can render this view from this camera. And this would be analogous to taking a photograph, right? And then what we'll do is we'll take that exact same view. I'm viewing a pre-rendered image here. And we'll project it back onto some geometry using the exact same camera. So I have the exact same scene, the exact same camera, and I'm projecting it back on. And this is what we would see. I'm going to hide this links. I'll jump out of camera 1 and go to the default view, and we can orbit around here in the GL view. And you can see the closer we are to the original camera view, if we look to the original camera view, everything is perfect. But if we move out of the original camera view at all, then you can see that, let me frame this here, then you can see the shadows that are being produced by projecting that image back on. There are a few other little caveats as well. A great example of something that doesn't really work perfectly in projection is the specular response of the sphere here. Specular is angle-based. So as the angle changes, one would expect this specular angle to slide around this object, but because it's being projected right back on and sticking to the surface, specular is not moving. So you would have the same problem if you project a photographic source onto a scene. none of the specular hits will move as expected. And there's a few ways you could work around it. You could either just deal with it, and if you don't move the camera too much, it may not be noticeable. Or you could paint the spec hits out of your projection image and create a shader for those surfaces and essentially render a spec hit only to create that specular response and composite that back in. So there's ways to deal with it. But one of the nice things about this technique, and that's part of the reason I wired up this particular example for you, is that it renders very fast. Now you saw how slow the original version of this rendered. Let's go into camera 2. We'll go into the 3D view again and edit camera 2. I'm just going to move it over to the side here a little bit, just so you can be sure that we're actually rendering through this, and we'll look at the render, and you can see it renders almost instantaneously. And this is one of the things that Nuke's scanline render is actually pretty good at, is rendering texture, not so much shaders and shadows and stuff in the case of the example of the original render, because it doesn't seem to be very quick at that, at calculating that stuff. But it is optimized for handling large amounts of texture. So if you wanted to project a lot of textures this way, you can create a fairly rich scene using simple geometry but lots of textures.